After the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, the American Civil War began in early 1861. Many, in both North and South, believed that the war would be short and decisive and end after one large battle. This illusion of a short war was shattered after the Battle of Bull Run, and many Northerners, including President Lincoln, realized that the war would need far more resources than first anticipated. All remaining illusions of a short war would be decisively broken after the two sides clashed for another battle in the contested state of Missouri. The war in the Trans-Mississippi Theater has often been viewed with secondary importance. The area never had the large armies of the Eastern or Western Theater. Despite this, the outcomes of the battle fought west of the Mississippi impacted the course of the war more deeply. In this series, we will examine the battles fought in Missouri and Arkansas during 1861 and 1862, and explore how these struggles by both sides affected the war. During this episode, we will look at the outbreak of war in Missouri and see how the two sides struggled for this key border state in 1861. Missouri had caused problems in the young USA right from the start. The Missouri Compromise of 1819 had been a very hot potato, which had been close to starting a civil war. Then, the Nebraska Act of 1854 again caused issues. After this, the population of Missouri had been heavily involved in what amounted to a border war with the Kansas Territory, often referred to as Bleeding Kansas. Fighting lasted from 1854 until a statewide referendum in 1860, which ended in a substantial vote against slavery, and Kansas was taken into the Union as a free state. The conflict meant that large parts of the population of both Missouri and Kansas were familiar with irregular warfare when the Civil War broke out. Missouri had much in common with the other states that would leave the Union in 1861. The state had several plantations, its economy was largely based on agriculture, and among the population there was a slight majority in favor of slavery. Claiborne F. Jackson, the Democrat governor of Missouri, did not openly support secession. He had in fact been elected on a platform that rejected secession. But soon after his election in late 1860, he quickly changed his tone. Missouri, as a whole, was not in lockstep with its governor. St. Louis, which was the largest and most industrialized city in the state, had newly acquired a very substantial population of German immigrants, who had deep misgivings towards slavery and strongly supported the Union. Jackson did what most states who attempted to secede did in early 1861 and called for a statewide convention of delegates to decide on the matter. Missourians voted, and when the committee met on February 26th, they elected former governor and war hero Sterling Price as their leader. Price was both known and admired throughout the state, and he favored remaining in the Union. After debating the issue, the delegates voted on March 9th in favor of two issues. 1. The current actions of the federal government are not substantial enough to call for secession. 2. Even if the currently undecided states decide to secede, there is no precedence for Missouri to do the same. The matter would then have to be discussed again. This surprised Jackson, but he had little choice but to accept their ruling. The attack on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers changed the matter for most of the undecided states. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina responded to the precedent by seceding, while Kentucky and Missouri refused to supply men for Lincoln's army. In the words of Claiborne Jackson, "Sir, your requisition in my judgment is illegal, unconstitutional, and revolutionary in its object, inhuman and diabolical, and cannot be complied with. Not one man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry on such an unholy crusade." Those who supported secession had a clear leader in the form of Governor Jackson, but the largely pro-Union and abolitionist population of St. Louis was not leaderless either. They found a rallying figure in the form of a congressman from St. Louis named Francis P. Blair Jr. He had understood during the Bleeding Kansas period that there would be a conflict over the issue of slavery in Missouri, and he had started to enlist sympathetic men, most of them German immigrants, into an informal militia who met and trained in secret. The men were willing to fight, and they were surprisingly organized. Those who were in favor of secession gathered in militia units as well, but they were not as organized. Pro-Confederate militiamen began making moves against federal arsenals, and Blair and his militiamen managed to secure the huge arsenal at St. Louis. It was said to have enough small arms to equip 10 divisions and had enough powder to blow half the city from the face of the earth. Blair, however, did not feel secure. The congressman had President Lincoln's ear, and he lobbied for increased support. This came in the form of a company of professional soldiers from Kansas, under the leadership of Captain Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon was a West Point graduate and strict disciplinarian who had served continuously from 1841. He was characteristic of the new Army officers. He was a fervent abolitionist and fanatically pro-Union, and believed without any exception that people who left the Union for the Confederacy were traitors and should be treated as such. Lyon and Blair were largely of one mind. They wanted to arm more men who supported them and secure Missouri for the Union. In this, they had one obstacle: Major General William S. Harney. He was Lyon's newly arrived superior and was much more old Army. A native of Tennessee, he was a conservative man who had started his service as far back as 1818. Lyon and Blair thought him to be too weak, and that he did not have the stomach to do what circumstances required. Blair went over Harney's authority and got permission from Lincoln to arm 5,000 loyal men. This outraged General Harney, who went to Washington in protest against the decision, and this left Lyon as their highest-ranking officer, which suited both him and Blair fine. They quickly managed to get permission from Lincoln to arm 10,000 volunteers for 3 months' service. Although the pro-Confederates in Missouri were less organized, they were enthusiastic. Governor Jackson called men to serve in a state militia who were meant to protect the neutrality of Missouri. These militiamen captured the federal arsenal in Liberty, but the contents were disappointing. Only 4 old brass cannons and old flintlock muskets. Jackson began secret correspondence with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, where he asked for ammunition and artillery. Jackson then ordered his militiamen to encamp just outside St. Louis under the command of Daniel Frost. Frost named his encampment Camp Jackson and began preparing to make a move against the arsenal. Meanwhile, Jackson's correspondence with Jefferson bore fruit, and 4 cannons were smuggled into Missouri and arrived in Camp Jackson in early May of 1861. Lyon viewed the militia encampment right outside the city as a clear threat towards St. Louis and the arsenal, and he decided to act rather than be acted upon. On the 10th of May, his newly equipped volunteers surrounded the camp and took the 900 men as prisoners, but 40 men agreed to be paroled, and the remaining 860 were marched through the streets of St. Louis. This caused reactions among some of the members of the crowd. Shouts were directed towards Lyon's soldiers, and eventually someone opened fire towards the Union soldiers. Lyon lost control, and his men fired back. In what became known in Southern newspapers as the Camp Jackson Massacre, 28 civilians died and about 100 were wounded. The incident was like a spark in a powder keg, and many Missourians who had been against secession changed their mind, including Sterling Price, and Governor Jackson was furious. He disbanded the state militia and established a new state guard under the command of Price. He was probably the best choice for command. In Missouri, he was almost a celebrity of his time, and recruits quickly began to swell the ranks. In the middle of all this, Harney returned from Washington and set up a meeting with Price. The two met on May 21st, and both wanted to find a peaceful solution. They agreed on a 3-week truce and would have further discussions at that time. This suited Price perfectly, and he used the time well to begin drilling his green recruits. Blair and Lyon were frustrated, and Blair used his contacts to have Harney removed from command, at which he succeeded at the end of May. Lyon was promoted to Brigadier General and was now in charge. On the 11th of June, the day which ended the armistice, The newly minted brigadier met Price and Jackson in St. Louis for further talks. In 4 hours, they got nowhere, and in the end, a furious General Lyon said, "Rather than concede to the state of Missouri the right to dictate to my government in any matter however unimportant, I would see you and you and you and you and every man, woman, and child in the state dead and buried. This means war." Price and Jackson left a short while later and boarded a train for Jefferson City, and as they journeyed there, the train stopped regularly to cut telegraph lines and burn bridges. Jackson called for 50,000 volunteers to join the State Guard in order to throw out the invaders. Lyon did not give Jackson and Price the time they needed and telegraphed Washington for more support. Knowing Jackson and Price had sabotaged a rail transport, he boarded steamships with 2,000 of his men and sailed up the river towards Jefferson City. He captured the city without any resistance 4 days after his meeting with Price and Jackson. Lyon had hoped to capture them and thereby end the revolt, but the two had retreated to Boonville with their forces. Lyon, who never wasted any time, pursued after installing a new loyal governor in Jefferson City. The two sides finally met for battle outside Boonville on the 17th of June. Price knew that the best his green men could do was to delay the enemy. Unfortunately for the ill-trained and poorly equipped guardsmen, General Price was sick and unable to take command. Command fell to Governor Jackson, who in turn handed over command to his nephew, Colonel John S. Marmaduke. Marmaduke, who would become a famous Confederate cavalry officer later in the war, was not up to the task. His men harassed the advancing Union forces with scattered musketry, but Lyon sent forth organized skirmishes and pushed the rebels aside with ease. On a ridge, they encountered about 500 guardsmen in a shabby line formation. Lyon, advanced with his infantry and his trained artillery crews, supported the advance with quick and accurate shelling. The fire from the Union guns frightened the guardsmen, and once Lyon's infantry closed ranks and fired off a few volleys, the rebels routed and fled. The Battle of Boonville, or the Great Missouri Lion Hunt, as it was dubbed in the northern press, lasted no more than 20 minutes, and although most of the state guardsmen reported for duty again and joined Jackson in his retreat, their morale had been shaken. The battle cost Lyon's force 12 men killed and wounded, while 15 rebels were dead or wounded, with another 80 being captured and paroled. Jackson retreated with the State Guard towards the southwestern part of Missouri. There, he planned to make contact with Confederate forces assembling in the area. There was, however, a problem with this plan. While Lyon had been routing and pursuing Jackson and Price in central Missouri, another Union force under the leadership of Francis Sigel had captured Rolla and Springfield and was now blocking Jackson's retreat at Carthage. Sigel was a German, originally from the Grand Duchy of Baden. He had studied at Karlsruhe Military Academy and participated in the failed German Revolution of 1848. After its failure, he fled and finally emigrated to the USA in 1854, and he eventually settled down in St. Louis. Sigel functioned as a rallying figure for the German-born soldiers in the Union Army, many of whom spoke little English, but when asked who they fought for, are said to have replied, "We goes to fight mit Sigel." He was, like Lyon, a Unionist and a fervent abolitionist. Sigel's campaign had been extremely easy up to this point. He had faced no substantial enemy forces, and he was aware that the rebels had been routed by Lyon. This caused him to be supremely confident when the two sides met for battle about 10 miles outside of Carthage. At this point, Jackson's force of guardsmen had swelled dramatically, and he had about 6,000 men. About 4,000 of these were armed with anything from captured percussion rifles, hunting rifles, old smoothbore muskets, shotguns, or knives, while 2,000 had no weapons of any kind. To face this force, Sigel had no more than 1,200 men and a few artillery pieces. He deployed his forces in battle line and began advancing on Jackson's force, who, in Price's absence, was under the leadership of James Rains. Rains was extremely popular among the troops, and he had a huge talent for recruitment, but as a field commander, he was little better than useless. He possessed no formal military training and had a fondness for liquor that occasionally incapacitated him. To begin with, Sigel's men pushed the rebel center back, but there was no rout. Rebel numbers began to tell, and Sigel's outnumbered force was pressed on both flanks. He began to fear being surrounded and started a fighting retreat back to Carthage. The two sides continued to engage each other. By the end of the day, were fighting small skirmishes in the streets of the city. Sigel was afraid of being surrounded by the much larger force and ordered a retreat, and it was carried out in good order. During the Battle of Carthage, the Federals lost about 40 men killed, wounded, or captured, while rebel losses were close to 200. Despite having suffered heavier losses, the rebels had held their ground, and it was a tactical and strategic victory. Morale soared. Jackson's men were able to continue their march towards Arkansas. The escape of the much smaller Union force was largely due to the incompetence of James Rains. Jackson's men arrived in Arkansas and encamped at a place called Cowskin Prairie in mid-July of 1861. They were joined by General Price, who had established contact with the Confederate Army and the Arkansas State Militia, who were in the same area. This complex structure meant that there were in practice 3 pro-Confederate armies in northern Arkansas, all under separate commanders. The official Confederate force was called the Army of the West and was under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch. When McCulloch took overall command, his former force was handed over to James McIntosh. Most of this force came from Arkansas, but had contingents from Texas and Louisiana as well. The Arkansas State Troops was under the command of Nicholas Pierce. All of his units were from Arkansas. He had the most artillery, and his men were relatively well drilled. Price's force was the largest in terms of manpower. His entire force hailed from Missouri, and although the largest, it was the most poorly drilled and equipped. Price's State Guard was organized into 5 divisions. In reality, most of these were barely the size of a small brigade, and only the 2nd Division of James Rains had been structured into formal brigades. This divided force would have to function in unison if they were to fight and beat Lyon's well-equipped brigades. McCulloch was a general without formal military training, but he was highly experienced. Originally a native of Tennessee, he had been a close friend of Davy Crockett and had been traveling with him to the Alamo, but on the way he had become ill and thus avoided the battle. Since then, he had served for years as a Texas Ranger. McCulloch had a habit of personal reconnaissance and a disdain for military uniforms. On the field, he was usually clad in black suit. In many ways, he was a soldier's general, who was both admired and respected by the men. When the Confederacy was formed, he was the only civilian who was given a commission as a brigadier general by the Confederacy. McCulloch was in contact with Richmond and his superiors regularly, and he made clear to them that his intention was to move against Lyon and strike a blow, but there were obstacles. In his own words, on 18th of July, he noted, "I am anxious to march against them, and if all of the available forces now near me could be depended upon, I think we could with success. But upon consulting with General Price, in command of the Missouri forces, I find that his force of 8,000 or 9,000 men is badly organized, badly armed, and now almost entirely out of ammunition. This force was made by the concentration of different commands under their own generals. The consequence is that there is no concert of action among them, and will not be until a competent military man is put in command of the entire force. Under these circumstances, I do not think that there is any disposition on the part of the Missourians to advance until they are better prepared." The lack of a unified command especially worried McCulloch. Although he had little love for the proud General Price, he underestimated the speed at which Price would be able to move against the Federals. Just 2 weeks after arriving at Cowskin Prairie, Price was ready to march back to Missouri. McCulloch was able to write to Richmond on the 30th of July. "Sir, I have the honor to report that I am now at this place with my command on my way to Springfield. Since my communication of the 18th, I have been busily engaged in preparing my force for a forward march, and have been urging on the commanders of the different forces near me to be ready to cooperate with me, by furnishing the Missouri force with all the ammunition I could spare, and also what could be spared from General Pierce's command. I have given them sufficient to warrant them in again taking the field. General Price, with his force of between 9,000 and 10,000 men, is encamped around Cassville. His effective force will hardly reach 7,000, and they are nearly all armed with shotguns and common rifles. General Pierce of Arkansas is within 10 miles of Cassville, with his command of 2,500 men. His infantry is well armed. My brigade is also near me, amounting to about 3,200, and nearly all well armed. I shall move towards Springfield as rapidly as possible with the entire force and hope soon to put the Missourians again in possession of it. In fact, there was not really an option to stay in the area around Cowskin Prairie for much longer. The sparsely populated area could not feed the almost 13,000 soldiers that were present, and all three commanders decided to merge their units at Cassville before moving against Lyon at Springfield. With the redistribution of ammunition that McCulloch had undertaken, each man had about 25 shots on average, and this was well below the 60 they were supposed to have, and in other words, they had enough ammunition for one major battle. When all forces joined at Cassville, McCulloch managed to persuade the other generals that he should be in overall command. Pierce complied, as did Price, although rather grudgingly. Both sides were on course to what would be the second largest battle fought in 1861. This early in the war, neither side knew exactly what to expect from a full clash between two armies, and none of the commanders had led such large units in combat before. Hundreds of their men would soon fight, bleed, and die along a previously unknown river called Wilson's Creek. This has been our first video in our series about the Trans-Mississippi Theater in the American Civil War. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next one. See you then.